Every weapon's stats have changed, so which weapons will be strong now and which weapons will be weak? Watch to find out. And if you do enjoy the video, consider liking and subscribing. I'd appreciate it a ton. First is the common weapons. They all got a 50% damage buff. The auto cannons are still garbage, the thermal lances are still garbage, and the RPGs are still garbage as well. But for some reason, the thermal lance 2 only got a 34% buff, which is weird. Next, the uncommon weapons, and they all got a 70 to 71% buff. The plasma cannons are still garbage weapons. The shotguns are now much worse than before. The reason for this is because all the other rarity weapons got buffed a ton, while the shotguns barely got buffed. The shotguns are still usable, but they're definitely not a meta weapon anymore. Next, the long arms, and they're also much worse than before. The long arm 12 only got a 36% buff. This is probably to reverse the buff that they gave them a few months ago. The long arm 12s now deal 191,000 per mag and 38,000 damage per shot. You might think that this is still good, but the railguns and the EM rifles deal a lot more damage. Next, the rare weapons, they all got a 94% buff. The gauss rifles are still garbage weapons, the pulse cannons are still garbage weapons, and the rocket mortars are also worse than they were before. They're still a good weapon since they counter the EMs, but they do much less damage than before. They now deal 238,000 damage, but that's still not enough to kill most of the mechs in the game. For rocket mortars to be viable in the meta, you need the damage boost of either stalker or brickhouse. Stalker and brickhouse mortars are a pretty strong build in the meta right now. The javelin rocks are also worse than they were before. The 12s now deal 75,000 damage, but they're still not a very great weapon. Next, the epic weapons, they all got 120% buff. So the helix racks aren't very great, and the cryo javelins aren't very great as well. The cryo javelin actually got buffed more than the javelin rack 6, which is interesting. So it's better than the javelin rack 6, but still not that great. And the stasis beams are still garbage as well. And the missile racks are still a good weapon for 2v2, but not that great anywhere else. One missile rack 12 deals 141,000 damage, so two missile rack 12s deal 280,000 damage, but that's still not enough to kill most of the tanks. You'll need to use the radius to get back damage on them to kill them. And the arc turrets are still pretty strong, but they're getting overshadowed by the other legendary weapons like the graviton beams and the miniguns. They now deal over 200,000 damage per mag. You might think that this is good, but the graviton beams and the miniguns are much better. Not only do they kill enemies quicker, but they have a longer range and a better mag as well. And the nade launchers are still a pretty decent weapon, but the thing that's holding them back is that they don't have a legendary pilot. They only have an epic pilot, so their damage is really bad right now. But once the legendary pilot comes out, I think they can be a strong weapon. They're a really underrated weapon that can be a good EM counter. They counter builds like Redeemer EMs and Surge EMs. Mortars can't counter those builds because they're too fast, but the nade launchers can. The nade launcher 12 right now deals 108,000 damage per mag and 13.5 thousand per shot, but that'll be much better once the legendary pilot comes out. And the voltaic RPGs are still not a very great weapon. The 16s deal 168,000 damage per mag and 42,000 damage per shot, which is much worse than the other 16 energy weapons. Next, the legendary weapons, they all got 150 to 151% buff. The miniguns are actually a strong weapon now. The minigun 12 almost deals 800,000 damage, and it's a really good weapon on Surge. They're much better than the arc turret 12s, but not as good as the graviton beam 12s. The reason for this is that the graviton beam 12s only need 1 implant slot, while the minigun 12s need 3 implant slots. So with the gravitons, you can put a bunch of implants on that make Surge stronger, like the ability duration, ability cooldown, and the Surge dash distance. But with the minigun, you can only put 1 extra implant. And the railguns are actually a super strong weapon right now. They're not as good as the EMs and the disc launchers, but they're definitely a third best weapon in the game. The railgun 12s aren't as useful, but the railgun 16 is super useful. You can use the railgun 16s on mechs like Gatecrasher and Panther, and they're pretty strong builds. The railgun 16 almost deals 300,000 damage per mag, so that becomes almost 100,000 damage per shot, and almost 200,000 damage with both shots. So with 2 railgun 16 mags, you can deal almost 600,000 damage. And that's excluding the double damage, so that can be even more. The railgun 16s aren't as good as the EM rifles, but they're a good alternative. The graviton beams are also a super strong weapon right now. The graviton beam 12s are definitely the second best weapon on Surge. Obviously, the EMs are the best weapon on Surge, but the graviton beams are definitely the second best weapon. So the graviton beam 12s deal 150,000 damage per mag and 53,000 damage per implosion. The graviton beams are definitely the best sustain weapon in the game right now. The carbines are also much better than before, but not as good as the graviton beams. The 12s deal almost 200,000 damage per mag, which is pretty good. And the EM rifles are now the most OP weapon in the game by far. They were already OP before, but now they're even more overpowered. Although they got buffed 22% less than the other legendary weapons, they still deal way too much damage. If both EM Rifle 6s get double damage, they deal almost 200,000 damage. That's almost as much as the old EM Rifle 16. So if you were able to get the EM Rifle 6s for free from the event a few months ago, then definitely use them. And 2 EM Rifle 12s both with double damage will deal almost 400,000 damage. That means at optimal range, the EM Rifle 12s will now one-shot everything in the game. And both EM Rifle 16s with a double damage will now deal 528,000 damage per shot. So one EM Rifle 16 shot will deal 264,000 damage. That's enough to one-shot almost every mech in the game. This amount of damage should not be in the game, and the EM Rifles need to get nerfed. The disc launchers are also super OP right now. They're not as OP as the EM rifles, but they're a close second. The disc 8s and the disc 16s got buffed 6% less than the 12s, which makes them a bit weaker. But they now deal crazy amounts of damage. The 12 now deals 20,000 damage per shot, and the 16 deals 28,000 damage per shot. But when you factor in both disc launchers and the back damage, the 12s deal 80,000 damage per shot, and the 16s deal 112,000 damage per shot. This becomes 480,000 damage per mag for the 12s, and 674,000 damage per mag for the 16s. That's an absolutely crazy amounts of damage. And getting back damage with the disc launchers is not uncommon. And it gets worse when you factor in damage boosts. A stalker with disc launcher 12s dealing back damage with the predator drive damage implant while the predator drive is active will deal 144,000 damage per shot. This is an insane amount of damage. So a stalker with disc launcher 12s can deal 865,000 damage per mag. That's an absolutely mind-boggling amount of damage. And a stalker with disc launcher 8s can deal 546,000 damage per mag. This is why I think stalker disc is still a super meta build. Although stalker disc is now much squishier and you have to play much more passive with the build, I think the damage alone is still enough to make it a meta build. The same goes with brickhouse disc as well. It's also a super meta build. So the top 5 weapons in the game right now are 1 EM rifles, 2 disc launchers, 3 railguns, 4 graviton beams, and 5 either rocket motors or miniguns. Rocket motors and miniguns both have their uses. Rocket motors are viable with the damage boost of either stalker or brickhouse, and miniguns are a good weapon on Surge. Anyways, if you guys enjoyed the video, like and subscribe, and see you guys.